Darkness lurks in the unassuming corners of our world, sometimes hidden behind the most ordinary of faces. In the unremarkable suburbs of Seattle, Washington, during the 1980s and 1990s, that darkness found its embodiment in Gary Leon Ridgway, a man who would become one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Known as the Green River Killer, Ridgway's reign of terror spanned 2 decades, claiming the lives of at least 49 women, though he confessed to murdering more than 70. Ridgway's life was unremarkable on the surface. Born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah, he grew up in what seemed to be a typical working-class family. However, behind closed doors, dysfunction simmered. His father, a bus driver, often complained about sex workers, a fixation that would later manifest in horrifying ways. His mother, domineering and overbearing, humiliated young Gary by washing his genitals well into his adolescence. These early experiences, combined with Ridgway's low intelligence and difficulty in school, planted the seeds of a deeply fractured psyche. Ridgway married young and joined the Navy in 1969, but his behavior betrayed a more sinister undercurrent. While stationed in Vietnam, he engaged with sex workers, a pattern that persisted upon his return. Despite his seemingly stable life, which included jobs painting trucks and a series of marriages, his darker urges could not be contained. Ridgway's killing spree began in 1982. His first known victim was Wendy Lee Caulfield, a 16-year-old runaway whose body was discovered in the Green River near Kent, Washington. Over the next few years, bodies continued to surface along the riverbanks, in wooded areas, and near truck stops, places Ridgway frequented under the guise of picking up sex workers. Ridgway preyed on the vulnerable, primarily sex workers and runaways. He would lure them into his truck, promising payment or companionship, only to strangle them with his bare hands or a ligature. Sometimes, he would return to the dump sites to commit necrophilic acts, further desecrating the remains of his victims. His ability to blend in with society made him all the more dangerous. To neighbors and coworkers, he was a mild-mannered, reliable man, someone no one would suspect of such monstrous acts. As the bodies piled up, panic gripped the Seattle area. The King County Sheriff's Office formed the Green River Task Force to investigate the murders, but progress was slow. In a chilling game of cat and mouse, Ridgway stayed one step ahead of law enforcement, exploiting their limited forensic capabilities. Ted Bundy, the infamous serial killer, offered his insights to the task force in the mid-1980s, suggesting that the killer was likely revisiting his crime scenes and engaging in necrophilia. Bundy's eerie accuracy provided investigators with a psychological profile of the Green River Killer, but it was not enough to catch him.
Ridgway adapted his methods to avoid detection. He began spreading his murders across different counties and states, making it harder for authorities to connect the dots. He also took measures to minimize forensic evidence, sometimes leaving rocks or debris inside his victims' bodies to prevent them from floating to the surface.
The killer's cunning was matched only by his insatiable appetite for death. He sought control and dominance over his victims, delighting in their terror. He often strangled them from behind, forcing them to confront the inevitability of their demise. To him, they were not human, they were disposable. For nearly 2 decades, Ridgway evaded capture. In 1987, he was briefly on law enforcement's radar when a sex worker accused him of attempted abduction. Police took a saliva sample from Ridgway, but without advanced DNA technology, it remained an inconclusive lead. Ridgway continued his double life, remarrying and maintaining the facade of a devoted husband while pursuing his depraved urges in secret. In the 1990s, advances in forensic science began to close the gap. DNA profiling emerged as a powerful tool, allowing investigators to revisit old evidence with fresh eyes. Ridgway, unaware of the technological tide turning against him, continued to live quietly in suburban Seattle, convinced of his invulnerability. In 2001, the DNA evidence collected from Ridgway years earlier was finally processed and matched to semen found on 3 victims. With this breakthrough, law enforcement moved quickly, arresting him on November 30, 2001. Under interrogation, Ridgway was cold and calculating, confessing to killing dozens of women. He described his methods with chilling detachment, recounting how he lured his victims, gained their trust, and ultimately ended their lives. He showed no remorse, referring to his victims as garbage and admitting that killing them was easier than dealing with a divorce. Ridgway struck a plea deal in 2003 to avoid the death penalty. He provided detailed accounts of his crimes and led investigators to the remains of additional victims. The final tally stood at 49 confirmed murders, though Ridgway claimed the number was closer to 80. His confessions painted a picture of a man driven by a compulsion he could neither control nor explain, a predator who thrived on the suffering of others. In December 2003, Gary Leon Ridgway was sentenced to 48 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus 480 years for tampering with evidence. He was incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary, where he remains to this day. For the families of his victims, the sentence brought some closure, but the scars left by his actions are permanent. Ridgway's crimes have left an indelible mark on the collective psyche of the Pacific Northwest. His ability to evade capture for so long, despite the scale of his atrocities, is a chilling reminder of the fragility of justice and the darkness that can hide in plain sight.
Gary Ridgway's actions force us to confront an uncomfortable truth: the face of evil is often unremarkable. Psychologists who studied Ridgway described him as a textbook psychopath, an individual devoid of empathy, remorse, or regard for others. His ability to compartmentalize his life was chilling. While he methodically hunted, killed, and discarded his victims, he simultaneously maintained a facade of normalcy as a husband, co-worker, and neighbor.
Ridgway's intelligence, often described as below average, belied a cunning nature that allowed him to evade capture for decades. His lack of remorse was particularly striking. In interviews, he revealed no sorrow for the lives he destroyed, no empathy for the families left behind. His focus remained squarely on himself, his own satisfaction, and his freedom. Perhaps most disturbing was Ridgway's methodical approach to killing. He viewed his victims not as people, but as objects, things to be used and discarded. This dehumanization was a crucial element of his psyche, enabling him to commit such heinous acts without hesitation or guilt. Ridgway's ability to continue killing for so long also highlights systemic failures in society and law enforcement. Many of his victims were sex workers or vulnerable individuals living on the margins of society, people often overlooked or deemed less worthy of attention and protection. This stigma played a role in the slow progress of the investigation. For years, the public viewed these women as throwaways, and Ridgway capitalized on this indifference. The Green River Task Force worked tirelessly, but their resources were limited, and the technology of the time hindered their efforts. Even when Ridgway became a suspect, the lack of solid evidence allowed him to slip through their grasp. It wasn't until DNA technology advanced in the late 1990s that the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The case is a sobering reminder of the dangers of neglecting the most vulnerable members of society. The stigma surrounding sex work not only allowed Ridgway to operate with impunity, but also delayed justice for the victims and their families. For the families of Ridgway's victims, the pain has never fully subsided. Many spent years searching for their loved ones, hoping against hope that they were still alive. When their remains were eventually discovered, the grief was compounded by the horrifying details of their deaths. Ridgway's confessions, while providing some answers, also brought a new wave of anguish. Some family members have spoken publicly about their struggles to move forward. The knowledge that Ridgway showed no remorse, that he saw their daughters, sisters, and mothers as nothing more than disposable objects, has been a bitter pill to swallow. Memorials and vigils have been held in honor of the victims, ensuring that their names and stories are not forgotten. The case of Gary Ridgway also raises questions about the nature of justice. By accepting a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, Ridgway avoided the ultimate punishment. While some have criticized this decision, others argue that the deal allowed for a fuller accounting of his crimes and the recovery of additional victims. Ridgway's cooperation led to the discovery of remains that might never have been found otherwise, providing some measure of closure to grieving families. Still, the fact that Ridgway lives on, confined to a cell but otherwise untouched, is a source of frustration for many. The families of his victims must contend with the knowledge that the man who caused so much pain continues to breathe, while their loved ones are gone forever. The Green River killings left an indelible mark on the Pacific Northwest, shaping the region's collective consciousness and serving as a grim warning about the depths of human depravity. For years, the fear of the Green River Killer hung heavy over Seattle and its surrounding areas. Even after Ridgway's arrest, the wounds inflicted by his crimes have not fully healed.
The case also brought significant changes to law enforcement practices. The failures and delays in capturing Ridgway highlighted the need for better communication between agencies, increased resources for investigating crimes against marginalized communities, and the importance of advancing forensic technologies. In many ways, the lessons learned from the Green River case have helped prevent similar tragedies.
Today, Gary Ridgway sits in a stark prison cell, stripped of the freedom he once used to commit his heinous acts. He spends his days in isolation, surrounded by the cold concrete walls of the Washington State Penitentiary. For a man who once reveled in his power over life and death, his current existence is a fitting irony, a life devoid of control or purpose. Ridgway's notoriety has made him a target within the prison system. Other inmates, many of whom harbor their own violent pasts, regard him with a mixture of disdain and revulsion. Ridgway's name may be infamous, but in the harsh hierarchy of the prison world, even he finds little solace. Despite his incarceration, Ridgway remains a figure of morbid fascination. True crime enthusiasts, criminologists, and journalists continue to analyze his case, seeking to understand the mind of a killer and the factors that allowed him to operate undetected for so long. His story serves as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the evil that can hide behind a friendly smile. While Ridgway's name is etched into history, it is the victims who deserve to be remembered. Each of the women he killed had a story, a family, and dreams for the future. They were daughters, sisters, and mothers, their lives cut short by a man who saw them as nothing more than objects for his gratification. In recent years, efforts have been made to shift the focus away from Ridgway and toward his victims. Memorials, documentaries, and books have sought to tell their stories, ensuring that they are not forgotten in the shadow of their killer. These efforts serve as a powerful reminder that behind every statistic is a human life, a life that deserved better. Even with Ridgway's confessions, questions remain. How many victims did he truly claim? Are there bodies that will never be found, buried in remote locations or hidden by the passage of time? For the families of the missing, these unanswered questions are a source of lingering pain. Ridgway himself has hinted that he may not remember all of his victims. The sheer number of lives he took, combined with the passage of time, has blurred the details in his mind. This lack of closure is perhaps the cruelest legacy of his crimes, leaving families to grapple with uncertainty even decades later. The story of Gary Leon Ridgway is a haunting reminder of the darkness that can exist within the human soul. It is a tale of unchecked evil, systemic failure, and the resilience of those left behind. While Ridgway's crimes may never be fully understood, the lessons they teach us are clear. We must do better to protect the vulnerable, to value every life, and to ensure that justice is not a privilege but a right. Ridgway's name may live on in infamy, but it is the voices of his victims and their families that deserve to be heard. In remembering their stories, we honor their lives and reaffirm our commitment to a world where monsters like Gary Ridgway can no longer hide.